Thank you so much for joining us, making it through this rain and wind. I wanted to bring a little bit of Cambridge nostalgia back to you here in California. How do we do?
On.
What's that? Amazing. Okay, good. We actually got 5 more days of this. So we ordered a little too much, so apologies, but glad you guys made it through here anyway. So I want to kick us off by first getting my clicker to work. All right. Let's see. There we go. By first thanking the team here at Samsara for hosting us in this really beautiful building. So fun story, the founders of Samsara, Sanjit and John, actually met at MIT. So at MIT's Computer Science Artificial Intelligence Lab, CSAIL, and they started a company called Meraki, which they ended up selling to Cisco for a cool $1.5 billion. Once they did that, they started their second chapter to start Samsara, which is an Internet of Things company. They do really cool work around, I'm gonna read this here, real-time data visibility, artificial intelligence insights, and cloud-based software solutions. Help organizations optimize operations, enhance safety and efficiency, and make data-driven decisions. I know they work in transportation, but they also do work in logistics, construction, energy, and manufacturing. Needless to say, involved in a lot of really cool hardware, meets software, meets AI, meets the real world. And so we're super grateful for them giving us the space, not just for this event, but for many events for the club. Speaking of the club, I am a volunteer organizer for the MIT Alumni Club, as is Alan, my partner in crime, for tonight. We have a couple of club leaders here. Could you all raise your hands? Yeah, there we go. So this is our president here, Teddy, head of our tech track, and our president. We are volunteer run, so if you are interested in participating, i.e. putting on events in this topic area and another topic area that is close to your heart, please reach out and talk to one of us before you jump off today. So I'm going to make a bold statement. I think that we are in the most interesting room in San Francisco this evening. I see, yeah, all right. I got a woohoo. I see a couple of, all right, questioning faces. Here's why. As I think about what are the most interesting challenges that we can be working on, they fall into a couple of buckets for me. One of them has to do with materials. All of the really cool rainwear that we wore into this building today, a lot of that we've realized is produced with materials that are really, really good at repelling water, repelling stains. But they also have another property, which is because they have such strong bonds, they don't break down very easily. They can then seep into our water supply. And it turns out that when we consume them or ingest them, they're actually correlated with higher incidences of illnesses such as cancer. So now we have these polluted environments and we have these materials that have these great properties, but polluted in how they're being made. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to clean those up? Energy. So as we decarbonize our economy, as we bring more manufacturing back into the US, we use, yes, more AI and more compute. We are increasing our use of energy. It's outstripping our supply. We're going into this hockey stick moment, and we need to find some solutions for those. The solutions seem easy. Why don't we just produce products with a different set of materials that aren't so polluted? Why don't we maybe get better at storing energy that is already being captured, or come up with new versions of clean energy, such as fusion? Challenge, though, is that when we look at our track record of being able to bring things to market, it takes a while. It takes a while to come up with the right mix of atoms and molecules and chemicals in order to come up with the product that we're trying to make. But it also takes a while for the whole supply chain to spin up, for it to be productized, for it to be brought to market, and to be put into our hands. So look at the track record of lithium-ion batteries, which we take for granted. You know, that journey started in, according to this, 1965. The other bucket that I think of has to do with health. So according to the World Health Organizations, the leading cause of death around the world is major non-communicable diseases like heart disease, diabetes, cancer. This is hitting us in the US, especially for maybe the first time in generations. Our life expectancy is actually decreasing. And we're also seeing that, compared especially to OECD countries, more developed countries. And the life science industry has done amazing work in bringing on new platforms and new technologies to be able to do things like use CRISPR for new gene therapies, or be able to have mRNA vaccines, which some of us took advantage of in the last couple of years. At the same time, it still takes about 8.5 years, according to the FDA, and $2.5 billion in order for us to go from figuring out what drug or what illness we want to treat to coming up with a treatment, going through clinical trials and bringing that out. So the question that I sit with is, how do we manage these two seemingly opposing forces, these really large, kind of intractable challenges, and at the same time, the fact that the systems that we have to solve those challenges tend to be very expensive and take a while. Is technology the answer for it, right? It feels like in San Francisco, that should be the answer for it. But we know that that's not the case. It's not that simple. These are large systemic challenges, but it does seem to be something in the air. Over the last few years, the team at DeepMind have been working on a platform called AlphaFold, which has been doing really interesting work. And as you can see here, taking amino acid sequences and figuring out what kind of proteins would be created and what those would look like, which is a much cheaper form of figuring out protein structures than the existing forms, which were X-ray crystallography, which took a lot of time and was very slow. At the same time, it's also a useful part of the drug discovery process. So much so that in the last month, before the election, I was like, man, when did this happen? I was like, oh, yeah, it happened like 6 weeks ago. But a lot has happened since then in the world. But they won the Nobel Prize for chemistry for their work in creating this platform. On the material side, we also see some really interesting developments. There's this cross-institutional project, the Materials Project, which is creating this really compelling database of both known and predicted material structures. And similarly, that's now being combined and married with robotics to up the street here in Berkeley, creating an autonomous lab that can figure out what kind of materials it wants to create and actually create those materials, test them, and close the loop and be able to, in theory, update the model and do a little bit of AI-driven or autonomous science. Question I turn to is, sounds really cool and compelling, and like you, I want to learn more about it. Is it enough to actually move the needle on these really large systemic challenges? There was a really great research paper released just a couple of weeks ago by an economics PhD student at MIT who did a study with an R&D lab of about 1,000 folks working in the material space. And they did a control study where they exposed different researchers to AI tools over different periods of time. And they found that pretty consistently, they were seeing that as folks were using these tools, they were doing better than the control group in being able to come up with patentable, innovative, essentially products from the materials that they were working on, which seems compelling. At the same time, got characters like these stalking the streets of San Francisco, right? We have a history of over-promising and under-delivering, and there's clearly a ton of hype right now in the AI space. And when it comes to the sciences, right, the proof is in the pudding. So is it going to be enough to actually move the needle? I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe nobody knows the answer to that question yet. What I do know is that we are in the most interesting rooms. Because we don't just have to speculate about it. We get to meet folks who have rolled up their sleeves and are actually implementing these sort of platforms, building them, productizing them across three of the most important sectors in the space. From government, from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, to academia at UC Berkeley, to industry, both at NVIDIA and at Toyota Research. And so over the course of the next 90 minutes, we're going to learn a few things. We're going to learn a bit more about what do we mean by AI for science and autonomous science and self-driving labs. What's the difference between those? We're going to learn about what are the cool work that they're actually doing. They're going to give us a sneak peek into what's top of mind for them right now. And finally, we're going to get to ask them some honest questions. What's the hype? What's the reality? Where are we? What do you think? You guys a little background. The way we're going to do this is first, we're going to start off with my partner in crime, who you'll meet in a second, Alan, who's going to show us, and I think this is especially inspiring for us sitting in these chairs, as an MIT alumnus who is a self-proclaimed not a scientist, being interested in the space, how he rolled up his sleeves and was actually able to spend time in the lab and contribute and advance the work that they were doing there, and also learn a ton. And we're going to see how he did that and what he learned. We're then going to move into 4 presentations from our expert panelists here. They're going to be about 10 to 15 minutes. And then we're going to have a chance to open it up for questions. We'll seat a couple, but we really want you to be interactive and to engage. This is ultimately a safe space. It's an MIT alumni club. And so we want you to ask anything that's on top of your mind. And then finally, as we have time, I know we started about 15 minutes late today, we'll do some more post-event networking. We get kicked out at 9 o'clock. Small asterisk. I don't know about you. It's been a while since I've taken a chemistry class. Maybe a couple of years, decades, maybe never. Some of the stuff that you're going to see in these presentations is really, really technical. And there's folks in this room who are just like, this is amazing. This is what I've been waiting for all week. Give me the technical data, right? And that's awesome. And there's going to be things for you as well. At the same time, I've also asked the speakers to be able to and show us some of the technical stuff, but also talk to us about the impacts at a high level so that folks like myself can understand what's going on. And so if you feel overwhelmed by the amount of chemistry and formulas that you see on the screen, bear with us. There's going to be a lot of really great content for everybody here. With that, ready to dive in?
Yeah.
Okay, Alan.
This is my not a scientist wall of all the things that I've done. I have worked in software for the last 20 years. I've built operating systems, done a lot of radio stuff. Definitely in the sort of high-tech world, my latest project I've been working on, I just have to plug this for half a second, is building learning management systems for people on the very edge of the internet. You want to talk to me about this, please come talk to me. Always love volunteers, technical, non-technical people who are interested in education. But this is all software. I'm just basically a software tech guy, not a scientist. Sure, graduated from MIT, class of 05, physics, but that's sort of where the science part stops for me. But that does not stop me from engaging. A couple of years ago, I have a friend who happens to be a professor at BU, and he gave me a tour of his lab. And I mean, I've been in lab spaces before, but this was something different. This is something I hadn't seen before. There's a series of like robotic arms and robotic slides and all these different instruments in between them. And they were conducting experiments and feeding these results from the experiments into a machine that then would plan the next experiments and do these on iteration. And they would do this in a closed loop to like optimize some parameters. This is his lab as of now, but actually some of the people are in the room here that were in there before. That's it right there. This is Keith Brown. His lab is one of the early pioneers in experimentation, these like autonomous experimentation platforms. Some people call them self-driving labs, though I think outside of that community, it's a little bit of a confusing term because they think it's cars of some kind or like labs inside cars or something like that. But they probe vast parameter spaces with intention of trying to optimize some aspect of it. And there's lots of different of these across different labs in the world. They focus on a material side of this, in particular polymers. And these machines are able to do in weeks what it would take years for humans to conduct and go through the full loop of analysis and coming back to it. This is us, and actually, I just took this picture a couple weeks ago when I was in his lab. He's a scientist. I'm not a scientist, but it was an amazing opportunity because I was so interested in this. As he walked through some of their biggest challenges, I realized these are like challenges every organization that builds large systems has. how do we get the data from here? How do we make an interface that works? How do we store stuff? How do we transfer it to other labs? These are things that I knew how to solve working in big software tech companies. And so that 20 years of experience, didn't seem such a bad idea anymore. And I just dove in. It was not, I would say, sexy stuff. It was not the deep science, but it was definitely stuff that helped getting the lab to work smoothly. So little bit of an inspiration for any of you who are like, hey, I like this stuff. I'm interested because you're here, but I'm not a scientist. You actually don't have to, not engage. Like you can, find a way to see where do your skills contribute and also learn something along the way. I'll tell you a few of the things that I did help with. I want to emphasize that I am not the primary researcher on these things. I am just I guess a really fancy tech support. That's what I call myself. This first one that I helped with, the Panda, which is a liquid handler. It's a lab that was designed to take open source software, off-the-shelf hardware, some 3D printed parts that they made, and a lot of ingenuity, and take a series of fluid handling and optical observations and do some electrochemistry. And what they were, like the sample project they had for this, what they were driving was actually trying to optimize the electrochromic switching. So applying a voltage to it, seeing how much it darkens the sample and how much you can see through it. And they would deposit a whole different set of films in these giant grids. And you can sort of see a little bit of a picture here. And they would just go through and try to optimize this switching. Another one of these, oh good, the video's playing, was a soft matter indentor. So this is a way of figuring out the elastic modulus of materials that you have, again, on these polymers. This is something that they routinely have to do. And so having these different instruments really helps them be able to automate something that otherwise they'd have to pay a grad student to do, and be able to iterate on these, and in the future be able to connect these systems together to be able to do lots of different observations and have more complex optimizations that they do. I think the thing that this has done for me is I get to engage with this lab. I then get to go on and go to conferences and other things and actually get to speak with people who engage in this in different ways. And when Nabil and I went to the Accelerate conference up in Vancouver, we really got to see people from academia and government labs and industry that echoed the difficulty in building these complex systems. And to me, I saw that there's a need for lots of people to engage in this process. So I encourage you, whether you're a scientist, whether you're not a scientist, please follow your passion in your spare time and engage. So it's inspired me. I want to inspire you. If you have not seen one of these in action, I'm going to give you a preview of a video that BU put together of one of these self-driving labs that's in the Cab Lab at Boston University, and see what you think. All right, fantastic. So now we actually get to the meat of tonight. We have 4 great panelists. And to kick us off, we're going to have Aditi Krishnapriyan. She is an assistant professor at UC Berkeley in the Chemical Engineering and EECS department. She develops machine learning methods tailored to scientific challenges with special focus on physics-inspired models. She's going to dive into details of some of her work tonight for us. Aditi, please take it away.
So yeah, happy to kick it off today. I think the introduction was actually pretty great for setting the stage of why we're working on the problems that we're working. I'll be talking today primarily about where we're at with the fundamental machine learning methods that we're looking at for chemistry and materials problems, and how do the problems in this domain contextualize with broader fields of machine learning that we see now, like what's going on in natural language processing or computer vision. So broadly speaking, the problems that our group really works on is this two-way street between machine learning and science. So on one hand, we're trying to directly use scientific insight to build new fundamental machine learning methods. So these are methods that don't necessarily work. Maybe there's methods developed for NLP. It doesn't necessarily transfer to scientific problems for a number of reasons. And we also want to develop and leverage these machine learning methods to advance these scientific problems that we care about. So it's really, I think of this as we're an ML first group within science, within ML, within science. So chemical and material systems can be described by what we call an underlying potential energy surface. So you could have some molecular system here. It could be described by this really complex potential energy surface. And this is what physicists have been spending centuries trying to really understand. So when you have the energy of a system, all of the downstream applications derive from that energy. So if you want to run molecular dynamics simulations, you run these simulations over time. That comes from querying the energy function, differentiating it to get the forces, and so on. If you want to do any type of free energy calculations, you might want to do this for drug discovery, where you're trying to fit how a molecule binds to a protein. Again, all comes from the potential energy surface. And this is really one of the big bottlenecks, so to speak, because when you do energy calculations via quantum mechanics, it's really, really computationally expensive. So it scales very, very poorly. And forget about experiments even. That's like one level beyond that, that if we can't even get some computational insight, we're still pretty far from the actual experimental labs. And so something that's come out as being very popular is using machine learning as a surrogate model for querying this potential energy surface. So maybe you use machine learning, you get a much quicker answer here, as opposed to what we would take from doing experiments or running really expensive numerical simulations. So I think AI for chemistry and materials and physics, it's at this interesting crossroads in that on one hand, we have Moore's law over here that we're increasing with more and more compute. And we've seen a lot of this effort work well in vision and NLP. Again, actually, the point of this talk is not that scale is all you need, because I think that's a very simplistic take. There's a lot more nuance beyond that. But I think one thing we really do need to think about in AI for science is how do we build these general purpose ML methods that are going to be compute efficient, and they'll continue to scale with increased compute, and they'll continue to efficiently exploit these computing capabilities. So keeping up until this point, I think many of the models and methods people were creating in AI for science were super constrained, very small models, didn't generalize well to a lot of different applications. But I think going forward, if we want to make the same progress in this field, I think we really do have to think about how do we leverage the ideas of compute when we design the next generation of methods. So one thing that we've looked at on this note is really this idea of how do we do this systematic studying of the best ways to utilize compute, scale a model across different prediction tasks and systems. And one thing about this is that I think there's many ways to be clever here. So you could be clever by thinking about, is there physics you can put into the model? But I think you can also be really clever about, are there ways that we can actually make these methods really efficient? And can we actually leverage certain types of methods to learn the best representation of our chemical system? So one thing here was actually that we, maybe you're aware of, attention is all you need. So this is a fairly famous paper that has essentially kickstarted a lot of the revolution in AI that we see now. And this idea of attention actually hasn't been really exploited that much for graphs, which are actually the most common types of systems that we look at in science. So molecules are really well represented by a graph. Climate models, you can represent grids as graphs. And one thing here was that we actually came up with a new graph attention mechanism for learning the representation of these different molecules. And this was actually something that you could then completely optimize with the latest updates that we have with really efficient GPU kernels. So I think this is just an example of we get the best of both worlds. We can be clever about the problem setting, but we also keep in mind, what do we do when we move to a world with more compute and more data? And I think materials project was already mentioned here. There's also been many large data generation efforts like the Open Catalyst project. So this is where you have catalysts to convert carbon dioxide to some type of better form of natural gas. And I think there's been a lot of attempts to really now build larger data sets so that we can actually try to tackle these really hard scientific problems with AI. And so we have this model that really focused on this systematic scaling approach. It was the top performing model across these very common chemical benchmarks. So materials project, as mentioned, as well as Open Catalyst, as well as something called SPICE, which is a molecular benchmark. And I think one thing also that is interesting in this field, which is not really true, I think, in a few of the other fields of machine learning, is that by actually focusing on scaling and really coming up with more clever ways to do this, we were actually the first academic-only team to be the top model on data sets like Open Catalyst. So before this, it was all industry teams, Meta, Microsoft, and a few others. And I think this really shows that actually this field is much more democratized right now. We can actually develop new methods. We can actually train large-scale models and actually do open science. So that was one of the big things, that we're making all the code public, all the models public, so people can go use them from this point on. So one other thing on that note is, so a lot of the things I'm talking about are very at the foundational level, so building methods at the ground level, but how do we filter those to upstream to start seeing real impact in science? I think this is a nice example of how really nice, efficient methods and advances on the machine learning side can actually impact real science problems. So one example here is finding transition states, which is really crucial to understanding any type of mechanistic analysis of chemical systems. So in this case, transition states simply mean that you have two states in a system. You want to figure out what's the lowest energy path between those two states. And there could be a huge number of paths. Like typically, it could be on the order of millions in some cases for these really complex reactions. So we need to figure out a way to filter that out to find what the most common mechanisms are. So when we actually go and make materials in the lab, we can figure out what's the lowest energy pathway that's most likely to appear in the real world. And this is an example of how you can see this in batteries, where we look at electrolytes and figure out what the pathways are, or we look at catalysts and we figure out what those transition energy paths are. So we have collaborators. One very nice thing about being at a university is there's so many departments there, and we also have the national lab right up the hill. So our collaborators in the chemistry department and also at Berkeley lab, just up the hill, they developed this method to find transition states, and you could add this on top of any machine learning model that was trained on a large data set. And they were really having trouble using their method. And our model came out just in time for them to actually start leveraging it. And it was actually the only model that was fast enough and accurate enough for them to use. So before the standard approach, this was the really slow approach that's also fairly unreliable. The atoms are flying everywhere. This is actually a very high energy path. I'm not even sure it's converged. And on the other side, that was our model, and then they applied their method on top of that. And this is, I think, a dissociation reaction, and it's a lot smoother to see what's going on.
So for those of us who are chemically illiterate, what are we supposed to pay attention to the right that's better than the left?
Yeah, so if on the right hand, so these are basically certain types of dissociations where a molecule is breaking apart. There's some energy process that happens. And on this side over here, the molecules are flying everywhere. and they're also bumping into each other, that's super high energy. It's probably something that would never exist. On the other side, you see that there's a much more clean break. So the molecules are coming across and then going more gradually to the other side. And it's essentially a much more physical reaction of what we see and a lower energy reaction as well. But I think if I plotted the energy curves, it would be more obvious, but I think animations are more fun. So one thing looking forward also, again, I mentioned that even though we're an ML first group, we really need to be listening to what's going on in science, using that to inform the methods that we develop. So we talk about building these models, but when it comes down to it, the chemists and the physicists, they want to use really fast specialized models. Maybe they only have one GPU at most. They can't really train really large models. And so they might be interested in maybe, sure, you have some really large model that this is the really efficient model that has been trained on a lot of data. But at the end of the day, the practitioners only care about studying very specific material systems. So they might only care about amino acids or this material called perovskites, and maybe that's the only thing that they want to optimize on. So one thing that we've also worked on is this idea of distillation, where we take a really large model and we distill it into these smaller specialized models. And those specialized models can then be run much more quickly for whatever downstream application you care about. And in this case, the approach we actually used was based on doing a distillation of taking multiple derivatives of the energy to give you some information about the curvature of the potential energy surface. So one other thing that we need to be really careful about in machine learning is sometimes you train these machine learning models and you run a simulation with them. So we want to study this molecule over time. And sometimes things seem okay until they're not. And I think whenever I show, I'm always a little nervous to show this figure because if there's a chemist in the audience, you probably never want to use ML at that point. But this is something, this type of failure mode is something that you can run into with these machine learning models. And there's this need for reliability, I think, when we do AI for science. So if you generate something with an LLM and it's not quite there, but it's close enough, that's probably okay. But in this case, we don't really have that margin of error. We really do have to think about when we deploy this, what is the error and how can we make it much more reliable? And so one other thing we've been looking at is this idea of how do we bridge the gap between quantum mechanical simulations. So this is where there is more data, but also the fact is that at the end of the day, we want to be able to build these things and experiment. We want to be able to see things happen in a lab setting. And so another thing that we do work on is also trying to bridge this gap with multimodal data training strategies. So we train with simulation data, but we also come up with ways to then train it such that you can also incorporate experimental data and prevent these types of failure modes. And there's actually a lot of really fun math when you start to build some of these methods. So for example, there's something that we derived called a Boltzmann estimator that actually lets us train these two things together. And it's actually based off of differentiating when you assume you're drawing samples from a Boltzmann distribution. One example here is the system. We're running a molecular simulation over time. And as you run this simulation over time, you can compute observables about that system. So in this case, we've computed some type of diffusivity coefficient. And over here towards the bottom is the reference. So this is what has been measured in a lab. This is the experimental number. And you can see that when you train these models with sometimes only simulation data, you get that blue curve up there. So this is pretty far off of where we should actually be in terms of what the true answer is. And they're also not very stable simulations, so they actually become so unstable that you just have to stop the simulation because you're not getting some actually good sample. It's a very bad sample that is going to naturally give you the wrong answer. But when you combine these two training strategies together and you train with both simulation and experiment, you get something more like the orange curves here. So you're running these simulations over time. You can do it stably for much longer timescales without anything blowing up. And ultimately, the observables that you're predicting are much closer to what the true experimental observables would be. And so I think these types of techniques are also going to be pretty crucial in the future to try to bridge this gap between both what we do with simulation, but also how does that close the loop and come back to what we see in labs and what we do in experiments? I think that's all I have, so thanks.
We have to do a quick transition of laptops. So if we wanted to grab one question for Aditi, we actually have time for that. I'll let you know. So what kind of models are you using here?
So for which part? So
Well, the political going part, I've seen that there was thinking models, but he's trying to do.
So-
models. I was kind of curious about that.
So most of the models that are used in the chemical and materials space are based off of graph neural networks. And so these are assuming that the molecule has a graph structure, you represent the nodes, you have some radius cutoff, and you do some type of message passing to learn over and update the features. I think this is something that's actually also very different from AI for science versus other areas of AI because we have these graph-based methods. And I think there'll probably be a little bit of convergence between the different fields in the near future.
So the number of edges grow really, really fast. The increase of nodes, even worse than LN. So you don't mind sharing, since you said you opened everything. What kind of size of the models are you talking about?
Yeah.
Nodes and edges?
Yeah, so typically when you represent, say, a molecule, you use some type of radius cutoff that determines what is going to be the neighboring nodes in the nearest neighborhood graphs. And typically that cutoff is not going to be super large, but people do these types of message passing mechanisms so that you can actually try to capture interactions from further out in the neighborhood graph. As far as the model parameters of the models that we trained, we were training anywhere from 800 to 400 million. Now we're going a lot higher than that, but those are still pretty tiny compared to what we see in other fields of ML.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Aditi. We're going to move on to our next. This is Wen Jie. Wen Jie. He's the product lead for AI for chemistry and material science at NVIDIA, which had big announcements this week, which I'm sure you'll get a chance to talk to. And he has a team of builds teams of tools and researchers that leverage some of these things that we've been talking about for our chemicals and R&D. And let's hear about it.
Good. Hi, everyone. So great to be here. I'm actually an MIT alum. Did my PhD in course 5, graduated in 2018. And I'm a organic and polymer chemist by training. I did not do any simulation, any AI during my PhD work. I am a pure wet lab chemist. And what I've realized over the last few years is that there's a lot of AI tools that have been developed over the last few years that is going to transform how research is going to be done. It's going to change how research is going to be taught. And it's just something that I wish was more widely available when I was a PhD student. But here I am at NVIDIA helping to build the future of chemistry and material science for future generation of scientists. So very pleased to be here. So maybe with a bit of introduction, the chemical and material science sector is a big one, some $5.7 trillion, about 5% of global GDP. But what's exceptional is that it touches almost all aspects of your daily lives, from the plastic fibers, the clothes that you wear. They are all mix of chemicals and materials. It helps feed the world through fertilizers. And of course, there's a bunch of specialty chemicals that goes into batteries, semiconductors, paints, fragrance, catalysts, you name it. And what I think is very interesting is that over the last few years, there has actually been an exponential increase in AI as applied to chemistry and material science. So you see over here, the mention of deep learning as in material science publications, as well as in even PhD syllabus these days in material science, have been increasing exponentially. And you see that in some of the publications, you see the materials project that was mentioned, there's different models that's open source. And of course, in recent years, a lot of the major tech companies, whether it's Google, Meta, Microsoft, have been publishing a lot of the industry-leading models. And when I think about how AI is going to transform and empower researchers along the R&D workflow, let's just work from left to right. You start with, of course, generating hypotheses, and traditionally, you will just read a ton of papers manually. you will formulate hypotheses based on intuition. You'll be exploring solutions based of 10 to hundreds of potential candidates. And you will really be your innovation that you look at is very incremental. It's based off from exploring chemistry rather than exploring new chemistry. And of course, you will try to predict properties of the materials you want to make, whether it's high band gap or what have you not. And it's based on intuition and prior experiments. And of course, in terms of trying to figure out what candidates to test and in the lab and so on, is based on intuition. And the synthesis and testing is laborious and it's all manual. So over the last few years, what has happened is that there is an AI-enabled future for R&D. For example, in the hypothesis generation step, you can actually start having chemistry-informed large language models. These are not your, GPT-4, what have you not. These are actually models that actually understand chemistry, and you can actually use that to synthesize vast literatures that you would never be able to read as human. You will also be able to leverage chemistry, LM, as thought partner in helping you to formulate your hypothesis. And in terms of defining the search space, you could actually be, rather than just be restricted to hundreds of that you can visually inspect, you can actually be searching through a large database of millions of candidates. And what's interesting is that just like you are able to use generative AI to generate text, you can actually use generative model to propose molecules with the desired properties. And moving to property prediction, it's getting a lot more interesting. And of course, Aditi, related to your work on MLIPs, there's actually a lot of property prediction that can be enabled by representation learning. So essentially, you can ask these models to learn by itself by predicting the next, just like you can predict the next word using by ChatGPT. You can actually predict what is the next atom, and in doing so, learn the underlying chemistry principle all by itself. And you can do AI-enabled simulations and so on. And of course, I'm sure my colleagues later on will be talking about self-driving labs and so on. There's a lot of work to be done that will be helpful in experimental validation. But unfortunately, a lot of the AI models and simulation application today are not making the full use of GPUs. And of course, that's where NVIDIA comes in. Just earlier this week, we have a major announcement at Supercomputing, where we announced Alchemy. Alchemy stands for AI Lab for Chemistry and Materials Innovation. And it will comprise of a set of chemistry-specific APIs and what we call NVIDIA Inference Microservices NIMs. And we are going to release the first NIM in the next few weeks. And it will be on this, thing called batch geometry relaxation. It will make a lot more sense when I explain it in subsequent pages. So let's imagine the typical workflow of, designing, say, the next generation battery, the next generation semiconductor. You start by, leveraging the entire materials universe, which is, 10 to the power 60. That's more atoms, more than the atoms that we have in the universe. That's that order of magnitude. And you might say that, hey, based on some heuristic, I might be filtering down to 16 million, a lot less, but it's still hard for you to actually test physically in the lab or even do simulation on. And it turns out that of these 16 million like candidates, not all of them actually are stable enough to exist in the real world. So if you are going to do a lot of simulation or even testing in the lab, you're wasting your time. So what we need to do is have an efficient way of determining whether something is stable enough to exist in the real world. And in doing so, you will get to the other side of the equation, where you'll be, having a short list of maybe 10 to 1,000 materials that you can now, do further simulation and eventually testing in the lab that eventually will give you the property of your desired property. So what is done now is that there's this process called geometry relaxation. So what that means is it's a way to find the lowest energy state that the material can be. And when we compare the energy difference between different lowest energy state, you'll be able to figure out whether it's stable or not. So it's a very simple conceptual. And how it's done today is that usually there's two parts to it. You have a model, an AI model that's usually run on GPU today, but it's not very efficient, even despite being on the GPU. And then there's also the other part where you are doing all this like energy optimization. And today it's run usually on CPU. As it turns out, when you have something running on GPU and then CPU, there's a lot of like communication overhead, and it slows things down. So what NVIDIA has to achieve is if we do everything in GPU using something called the NVIDIA Walk, which is essentially a developer framework in Python that enable GPU accelerated simulation. And by doing, what we call in-flight batching, essentially running multiple simulations in parallel. That helps improve the performance significantly. And what we have been able to show using two of the latest models, one on MACE that we mentioned is that's on inorganic solids, and my colleague over there, Melissa, has helped with another model called AIMNet2, which is for small molecules. We have been able to demonstrate acceleration of up, 100 to 800x. In this case, it's 100x. And of course, with that, you will start thinking that you can actually assess and test a much larger number of solution candidates. And in doing so, increase the time to finding the best candidate material for a given application. And just, a bit more data. So the acid state is 1x. You see that by just running everything on GPU and using the NVIDIA Walk Python developer framework, you get around 25x acceleration. And by increasing the number of what we call batching, which is essentially running things more in parallel, you get the further acceleration from 35x to 100x. So that's the first meme that we'll be releasing. We have already announced it. It'll be available for download in probably the next 2 to 3 weeks. And maybe to just end things off, I just wanted to say that, this work on using AI to accelerate scientific discovery is very new. And it's really a team sport where you need industry and domain experts, the AI scientists to work hand in hand, because of course the chemists know the chemistry and of course the AI folks know AI, but you really need to marry both of them together. And of course you'll need models, data sets, APIs, tools, GPU accelerated simulations. And what NVIDIA is providing is that we can provide the tools for accelerating AI for scientific discovery at the multiple entry points, whether it's at the lowest level of libraries, SDK frameworks, at the model level, the microservice name that I mentioned earlier, and all the way through, at the Gen AI workflow level of what NVIDIA calls blueprint. So maybe with that, I'll end my presentation and look forward to having more discussion with you guys later today.
Wen Jie. So we do have to transfer laptops one more time. So if we have a quick question, I don't know if you mind answering a question. We got a couple.
Yeah.
So how flexible, have you tested out how flexible the GNN implementation is? There's exploding in terms of the on makes right now. Do you think it's going to work for the frameworks too?
Yeah, so your question is it flexible enough to include other models? Yes, it will be. And in fact, we are exploring other models that we want to do similar acceleration. And of course, Melissa, my colleague just in front of you, is actually supporting on a lot of that.
I think we have one more right here.
Yeah, so one challenge our lab deals with is fitting simulations onto GPU memory. Oftentimes when we're doing like light physics simulations, then being able to fit the field of view or even the space run out of GPU compute memory. Is that something that your team is working on? Or like, is that a tool that could this tool help with that at all?
I think there are definitely a lot of different bottlenecks between the R&D, different workflows. And what I think will be helpful is, as much as, NVIDIA is a, large organization, there are limited things that we can work on. And what I think will be helpful is having, follow-up discussion with maybe you and your team to actually figure out what is, we want to work on, the most common bottlenecks first, so that we can help, create most benefit for the scientific community. So would love to have a follow-up discussion on how we can be potentially helpful there.
All right, thanks much. All right, we have our next panelist, Arash Khajeh. He is a postdoc research scientist in the Energy and Materials Division of the Toyota Research Institute. And his work bridges computational predictions and experimental validations for battery technology, and he's going to teach us about it.
Thank you very much, Aditi, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Today I'm here to tell you a little bit about how we try to use AI in computations to develop safer batteries. So you have probably seen photos like this in media or newspapers. This is one of the biggest challenges we are currently facing. In order to accelerate electrification, we need to develop a safer generation of batteries. These kind of problems originates from an important component in the batteries, and that's electrolyte. Electrolyte is like blood in the heart of battery. They carry ions from one electrode to another during charge and discharge, and the current generation of batteries rely on liquid electrolytes. Liquid electrolytes have some pros and cons. They have very high ionic conductivity. They provide very good interfacial contact, but they are thermally and electrochemically not very stable. And they can suppress the lithium dendrite formation, which is the main cause of these explosions, very effectively. As a result, the explosion can happen in a variety of different scenarios. During charging, driving, when the car is involved in some kind of collisions, or even when instead of liquid electrolytes, we have polymers, which are known to have higher specific energies. They have much better mechanical stability, thermal stability, electrochemical stability, but the main problem is their low ionic conductivity. So although there have been a lot of research around the polymer electrolytes during the last few decades, and the ionic conductivity of the best polymer we know today is almost one order of magnitude lower than liquid electrolytes. So the goal here is to design polymers with high ionic conductivity, but it's challenging because the design is very vast. We have so many options to design materials at different length scales. We can select different atoms, connect them differently in the repeat units, which are building blocks of polymers. We can arrange these building blocks at different ratios along the polymer chain. We can cross-link them, mix them. And we have many other options like salt types, concentration, and temperatures. So all of these make conventional methods to design and design new polymers inefficient. So to tackle these problems, Toyota Research Institute has founded several research groups during the last few years, both at MIT and Boston University. So our collaborators helped us to develop high-throughput robotic experiments, which is located at MIT. We call it Kahuna. And also, they helped us to develop molecular dynamic simulations workflow. Initially, we had a plan to make a comprehensive polymer discovery framework by connecting all of these components. For example, here we had robotics experiments, characterization methods, and simulations as evaluation tools. We had machine learning models that could estimate the properties or ionic conductivity of polymers. We had generative models that could provide new hypotheses, new materials that we could test, and some algorithms that could help us to identify the best next experiment. But it turned out that the experiments are still a bottleneck. Our collaborators are still not really comfortable with working with different materials, with different viscosities. Some of them are chemically modified. So we thought maybe in the first step, we could connect all of the computational components and see what comes out of it. So here we have, as we need a seed data, which is basically a database of polymer electrolytes and their ion transport properties. We can basically represent polymers with strings. We call them small representation of polymers. These are basically strings that represent the building blocks of polymers, repeat units of polymers. We can tokenize them, convert them to digits to make them machine readable. And then we could basically train our generative models on these data to generate new polymers, to propose new polymer candidates for us. So these are like GPT-based models. And these models can predict the next token until they reach a token that terminates the repeat unit. And then we had some evaluation methods, which is basically here molecular dynamic simulations. And then if we iterate through the loop and we add, evaluate more and more polymers and add them to the train set, hopefully at some point we could see something interesting, maybe a discovery. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these components one by one very fast. So the evaluation method here is molecular dynamic simulations. These are basically atomistic simulation that allows us to study the interactions between ions and the polymer and we can see how fast they can move in polymer environment. We automated molecular dynamic simulation workflow that we adopted from the work of our collaborators, specifically Professor Jan Schauhorn and Grossman Group. And these automated simulations take some inputs like small strings of repeat units, degree of polymerization, and so on. And they can generate amorphous structure, insert salts, and they can compute, at the end, we could compute the ion transport properties. And automatically, with minimum human intervention, we could start running thousands of simulations simultaneously and save the results eventually in the cloud-based databases. The next component, so we could apply this workflow to many, many materials. In collaboration with MIT, we published one of the largest databases of polymers. That consisted of more than 6,000 polymers with their ion transport properties computed from molecular dynamic simulations. And not only the properties, but also we made the raw trajectory available to everybody so that everybody can get access to the data, raw trajectory files. They could compute new properties, they can do new analysis. And then last year, I hosted an intern, very talented intern from MIT. And with his help, we could explore the performance of different genetic models to generate new polymers. So we explored diffusion-based models and GPT-based models. And these models can basically provide new polymer candidates and generate new polymer candidates. We could add the properties at the very beginning, like, for example, here 0 means low ion conductive polymers and 1 means high ion conductive polymers in their red boxes. And then we could use these numbers as a prompt to force the model to generate high conductive class of polymers. And then we define some evaluation metrics like novelty, uniqueness, chemical validity, and so on. And we had MD simulations to evaluate their ion transport properties. So a little bit summary of results we got here is that most of these models could basically provide almost the same performance if we could carefully tune the hyperparameters. But the computational efficiency of GPT-based models, specifically MinGPT, made it more suitable for what we wanted to do. So we selected the MinGPT for the next steps. So we connected all of these components and we added a feedback mechanism. The feedback mechanism gradually could add the promising candidate that we evaluate using MD simulations and add added to the train set and oversample from this search space. So I want to show you a very, very small part of the results we got. We were very interested to see if we can find something interesting using this discovery framework, if we can name it discovery framework. So we generated more than 1,000 polymer structures, and we selected the top 50 using predictive ML models that are trained on the original train set. We performed MD simulations on these, and interestingly, we saw some of these polymers exhibited the ionic conductivity even higher than one of the best known polymer up to date, polyethylene oxide. We did it for 2 iterations, and we also noticed an increase in the minimum and average ionic conductivity. But we stopped because the search space was exhausted, and the model started proposing the same polymers over more and more. So at this point, we wanted to know if we found something interesting. And it turned out that those high ion conductive polymers are a mixture of those structures that are not really stable because of presence of some bonds like NO and OO bonds that make structures very unstable, and some polymers that have been proposed by previously by researchers during the last few years. For example, some of these polymers fall under the category of polyacetals. They have different ratios of C2O ratio, carbon to oxygen ratio. And previously, researchers have shown that these polymers are interesting not because they have higher ionic conductivity, because they have higher effective conductivity, which is not exactly conductivity. That's a product of conductivity and transference number. Transference number is another property, important property for batteries, and that's basically the ratio of charge carried by cation over the charge carried by cation anion. So some of these structures, we still don't know how easy they are to be synthesized in the lab when we send them to our collaborators at MIT. But what we found here, interesting, is not really the materials. We didn't discover interesting materials, but what is interesting here is the limitations of these kind of polymer discovery. We saw actually a discrepancy between the ionic conductivity computed from simulations and, the first one is synthesizability. Now we know that some of these arrangements of atoms or bonds make the structures highly unstable. So now we have a better understanding. We can add them as a kind of filter to narrow down the search space or screen out those materials before we evaluate them. The other one is higher, the accuracy of the simulations. We found a discrepancy between the computed ionic conductivity from simulations and the measured value from experiments because basically we use a classical force field in MD simulations. These force fields are usually optimized for a certain range of compositions and structures. To make the computations more accurate, maybe in the future we can use a machine learning force field that can be tailored to a wider range of compositions or structures. And then, as I mentioned, there's a large gap between the ionic conductivity of polymers and liquid electrolytes. Maybe, in order to have a breakthrough into the conductivity of polymers, we probably need to have a breakthrough into design. So that means we need to be more creative. We can diversify the training set, or maybe we can work on more creative genetic models that can extrapolate the search space. And the final things is the materials discovery and design is always about the multi-objective optimization. Here we just consider the ion conductivity. But in the future, we should consider many other properties like transference number, thermal stability, and compatibility with the electrons. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. Here you see the photos of my other colleagues, who have been involved in this project. Thank you very much.
Awesome. We'll open it up to a question for Arash before we jump on to the next. Yes.
Yeah, I was curious about your motivation for working on polymer electrolytes and conductivity specifically. Is that a function of the SMILES model that you're working with, or just an area that you think is promising overall?
You mean in terms of representation, why we selected small strings, or?
Yeah,
Why
we're,
we use-
we're working with polymers as opposed to, say, inorganic compounds.
I think the motivation was, making a safer generation of electrolyte. The application was important for us in the first place. That was the main motivation why we selected partners and not.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you to Arash. So we have journeyed through academia, through industry. Now we're going to end up at the DOE up the street here at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Really a very important player in this ecosystem. We're going to learn more about autonomous labs. Here, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm Aldair, and I think so far we've heard a lot of really great content on kind of the role of AI and ML in computation, also about the role of compute, and also more so about application areas such as polymers for batteries, and really starting to hint towards, where are these experiments that are being done? What is ground truth? And I think a lot of my work has really keenly focused on really the experimental side, all of these platforms and technologies, and how do we think about that? So the way I kind of tend to see scientific discovery and accelerating that process is really through how do we develop new tools and approaches. And I tend to often think about this as best as I can from a domain agnostic perspective, but drawing in a lot of expertise from subject matter experts. And there's really, I think, as highlighted earlier today, this urgent need for better materials, better approaches for healthcare, and really starting to shrink the timeline that it takes for us to address any of these critical areas using the best technology available to us. And this is something that I tend to think about a lot of what is that scientific discovery process. And thankfully, there are frameworks to think about these problems. And one that I really like really has its origins in synthetic biology, and it's called the Design, Build, Test, Learn Loop, or DBTL. And when I tend to think about this, I really think about it in terms of these two factions, the decision-making and the experimentation, whether experiments are physical experiments or some type of simulation. And being fortunate enough to work somewhere like Lawrence Livermore and having access to a lot of these really cool instruments and facilities, here on your right-hand side, we have the Advanced Manufacturing Lab that has materials testing and fabrication and synthesis capabilities, and access to different subject matter experts. I really started thinking about how can we leverage this framework of DBTL in tandem with taking advantage of all the best instruments and tools that we have for scientific discovery. And very early on in my thesis work, which really happy to also mention that a lot of this that we saw earlier is from the lab of Professor Keith Brown at Boston University. We started doing a lot of thinking about the scientific process itself, and what we really converged on was really these two axes. One being throughput, so how many experiments are you doing? How many simulations are you doing? How many full-time employees might you need, or can robots help or automation help? But also information per measurement. When you do that particular experiment that took you, a week to synthesize, and you get that particular figure of merit, how are you capitalizing on that information that's being generated? And when we think of conventional research, you can think of, being at the lab or setting up your simulator for the first time. and then starting to really approach this from a discovery perspective. And what we started thinking of is, well, can you leverage tools like automation to increase throughput and leverage tools in AI and ML to increase information per measurement? And along this diagonal, we can then start thinking about this concept. And of course, there are different synonyms for it of autonomous science. And what does that look like? What does that mean? And this is something that I think is developing, but at least the way I tend to think about this is really combining automated experimentation. So whether that's physical experiments or simulators and machine learning in some way that allows us to conduct these types of experiments without human intervention. And of course, kind of starting to build upon this DBTL framework. So really looking back at this, we can think of autonomous science as having these two pillars of automation and some form of AI and ML. And I won't get into all the details today, but I want to give you essentially 4 vignettes of some of my work that spans from some of the self-driving labs that we've seen talked about earlier today, focusing on mechanical design, to autonomous science and simulation and how we're thinking about that, and some snapshots of self-driving labs currently being developed at Lawrence Livermore for different applications, and then starting to think about autonomous robots for science and how that might differ from self-driving labs. So diving into kind of the first vignette there, when we really think about designing materials and structures, kind of this workflow really, I would say, became both a template for how we started thinking about self-driving labs, both from a domain agnostic perspective and also a domain specific perspective. So in this particular aspect here, we can think of technologies like additive manufacturing that allows us to exploit a lot of design freedom from these instruments. We can represent these structures digitally. We can fabricate them. We can think of different types of lattice designs. And then ultimately, we have to test them in some way to assess the mechanical performance. And one property that is very challenging to predict even via simulation is the area under a force displacement curve that's called toughness, or the energy absorbed by that structure. So you can take that structure and you crush it and you get essentially a force displacement curve. And this is ubiquitous in whether you're doing fundamental materials development. You want to know what's the strength of that part, what's the energy to rupture of that part, to even developing larger structures. So what we started thinking about when we were developing this self-driving lab, we started thinking about how do we parameterize this problem in a way that it can blend well with AI. And of course, when we started looking at these different structures, we started seeing that the response was also very non-intuitive for even subject matter experts within mechanics. And this, as you saw a bit earlier, led to really the development of the Bayesian Experimental Autonomous Researcher, or BEAR for short, or Mama Bear as well. And what we see here is 5 3D printers around robotic arm that essentially, once you're fabricating that structure, you can pick up that structure, crush that structure, get the force displacement curve, and then the AI can decide what experiment you do next. And what's really great about this is that after we really solved what I consider as really the automated experimentation or the automation part, we then really got to have a lot of fun on the AI and ML side. And for this work, we particularly used an approach called Bayesian optimization, where we can take experimental results, build some type of belief or surrogate model, use something called a decision policy to then drive what experiments can then be executed next. But what was really great about this is that when we took a step back and really towards the end of my PhD, I started looking at the number of experiments we had done, but also looked at our particular objective throughout this timeline. What we saw when we put it in really fully just automation mode or high throughput experimentation, we were finding structures with high energy absorption. So that would be trying to maximize on the y-axis. But it took us about 1,800 experiments to get there. And when we started blending it with only autonomous experimentation or only the self-driving lab aspects, we were able to greatly decrease the number of experiments that we needed. But also, when we started then including simulation or finite element analysis information, we weren't only able to decrease the number of experiments, but also increase the energy absorption by the structure. So that was really interesting. And I think this really became the bedrock of what was the catalyst for some of my projects going forward. And what we started then thinking about is if we can do this with experiment, how can we then start doing this with all the great simulators that we have, whether that's for finite element analysis or even for simulators that might be important in climate science. And this was some work that we immediately started looking at of saying, well, what happens when we start looking at fancier architectures with more design variables and starting to take advantage of the finite element analysis pipeline. And here simulations are taking anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. So you can imagine this design space can quickly explode if you wanted to control every single design aspect of this. So we were really interested in can we now use the AI and ML aspects to accelerate this process and have it really drive the simulator. And using the same Bayesian optimization framework that we had been developing for these self-driving labs, we saw that we could also reduce the number of simulations that we needed relative to traditional experiments. And this was also super exciting because now it shows that this software and this approach that we're building is starting to really show benefits in even other areas. And then another project that I became involved in that seemed to be somewhat orthogonal to what I was currently working on in the space of climate science, but I also wanted to think about how can we start using ML and AI to bring these different parts together. And this is something that initially we started really thinking about because we had folks working on physics simulators, we had folks working on techno-economic analysis for CO2 technologies. And what we realized is people working on physics were working on one particular software stack, people doing techno-economic analysis were developing their own models. And I was there trying to do ML and machine learning and trying to get everyone's data. And after a bit of trying to see how can we put all of this together, we decided that, and we realized that by leveraging really the surrogate modeling aspects of the AI and ML part of really the concept of self-driving labs or autonomous science was really what was able for us to start stitching all of this data together. So really leveraging the surrogate modeling aspects. So instead of having the team doing only physics-based simulations or only techno-economic analysis, we can then start feeding all of that and building one specific surrogate model. And this became really excellent because now we were able to essentially build a front end that both people working on the physics simulators and also on the techno-economic analysis side, we can all sit together and look at this front end and see how is this affecting, for example, the production cost for a particular process. So this became also a very exciting and unexpected outcome than when we initially had started the project. And really kind of, again, focusing then on more so the automation aspects, it also gave rise to a funded project that we call a Modular Autonomous Research System, or MARS. And this is work that is done with my colleague, Diego Oyerasun. And here we're working on a self-driving lab for biological applications. You're going to see a lot more of robots here. We're combining a robotic arm with liquid dispensing robots, and again, applying the Bayesian optimization framework to really drive and select the next experiments. And for this particular example here, we're looking at peptides and lanthanides and really looking at what that binding chemistry might look like. In conjunction with my other colleague, Mason Sage, we're also building a self-driving lab for alloy discovery called APEX, or Autonomous Alloy Prediction and Experimentation. And here, this is still currently conceptual, and we're working on developing what this platform might look like. But my colleague Mason has a background in industrial automation, so how can we start applying those principles from industrial automation to alloy discovery? And some of my most recently funded work that's called Project Armor, or Advanced Robotics for Materials and Manufacturing Optimization and Research. Often when we think of these self-driving labs, they are pretty static. If you move the liquid dispensing robot or you move the 3D printer, your robot will have a very hard time retrieving what that particular object might look like. So here, we're really now starting to think about applying the AI and ML more at the instrument level. How can we make these robots or these instruments more adaptable, more self-correcting? So as shown in this video here, I'm able to play that. If we do have a particular configuration and this robot is able to execute a task such as weighing these particular vials, what happens when we move these objects around and we don't pre-program the robot to do that? How can we then start embedding these types of methods that we've seen in the area of robotics and really start bringing them to the applied sciences? And really starting to think about what does it even mean to have a robotic co-pilot working with a scientist at the bench? And what are the limitations involved with that? So kind of putting all of this together, a big question that I'm trying to answer from a multidisciplinary perspective is how do we integrate all these modern tools that we're seeing all the way from LLMs to robotics to even how we view science, to really start moving us diagonally into the autonomous science world where we're maximizing throughput, maximizing information per measurement, and really looking at this. And I think it was said earlier as really as a team sport. And of course, none of this work would be possible without all the many collaborators shown there on the right-hand side. Please get in touch if any of this is of interest to discuss working together, or even just to even chat more about the field itself. With that, I'd like to end and just say thanks to everyone.
Awesome. Well, thank you for those presentations. It is 8:30. And I know it was raining and windy outside, so for some of you, you might want to budget some time to go home. We are now going to open this up into an interactive panel. We've got some questions. We want to hear more of your questions. We've got the space until 9. If that said, you kind of need to leave, this is a great time to do so. Thank you so much for coming. Otherwise, I would love you to stay and hang out with us for 30 minutes. Cheers.
So one of the things I actually heard a few times during all those talks was some of the situations in which the predictability of some of these predictions, the generative methods we have, become really crucial. Where it's like you might create volatile chemicals, or because you might end up, leading down paths that are based like lots of time. So I'm curious about how you guys think about the observability of some of the things that you're doing as part of that process. I know we have actual experiments. You guys love it. Other things there's other kinds of workflows that are important to make sure that we are still safe as we're doing these things. And I wonder if anybody wants to take a stab at talking about observability as part of the process of building these different autonomous science vehicles. I guess I'll start with, because I mentioned all the chemicals. Arash, if you have anything to say, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't have any strong opinion about this. Maybe I can wait to the next question. Sorry.
That's totally fine. Aditi, I saw you nodding your head. Have you thought a little bit about this?
Yeah, it's so you mean like, so I think one really big challenge in materials is that it's really, really hard to synthesize these materials. So you can have many levels of theory when you're doing computation. There's many levels of accuracy, but then actually seeing something in the lab is really, really difficult. And I think the typical time of material discovery to actually realizing it in some real world form, I think that's around 18 years right now. So I think there's actually a lot of challenges that come with that synthesizability aspect, but also even just building really good predictive models when the data you have comes from different levels of theory is another task that I think is really hard in materials, connect that to theory to actual outcomes.
Wen Jie, one of the things that you said is, hey, AI for science is relatively new. It's a team sport, right? We need help up and down the stack.
Yep.
I think one of the things that I've seen in the life science space is that intellectual property often gets in the way of folks being able to collaborate, share data sets, train better models, and so forth. How is it in the materials and chemical space?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think the most important thing is actually the data sets, because that will inform the quality of the models. And I think as for now, a lot of there are companies like Meta that publish the open materials model just earlier this year. I think that is a very positive first step. But having said that, more generally, there aren't that many data sets out there. And one thing that is unfortunate is that for all of the data that is available out there, the majority of it is actually in inorganic chemicals. They are very, the data sets that are high quality, many inorganic materials, and that of course has led to models that are primarily focused on organic materials, which is important. What would be helpful as well is definitely to have more data sets that are on the polymer side as well as on the organic side. But unfortunately, a lot of those data,
there's two kinds. One is that it's with the companies, the chemical companies, which probably would not have any much incentive to share the data. And then secondly, even if they are willing to share, a lot of those data are not digitized. They are stuck with physical lab notebooks. And I think that is not trivial to get access to.
I see. What I'm hearing is this whole digital transformation wave that has yet to hit, chemical companies in a way that prepares them to be able to take advantage of data sets that they have.
That's right.
Okay.
I'm gonna open the floor here. We ran way over, and so we were gonna try to end sometime around now. But one of the great things we got to do is actually ask questions as thing went along. So we may have accidentally moved all of the panel discussion to the middle of the thing. So if there are no other questions, oh, we do have other questions. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. All right, throw them on up there. I guess since you do it up first, why don't you go ahead? Thanks.
To what extent was like the training? I mean, you talked a lot about using models, but maybe I haven't listened to any talks for a while. But I remember AI talks used to be like how difficult the training was, and how long that was taking, and how they needed more money or more GPUs. Or so what? It didn't seem to me that training was your problem for any of you. Is that true?
I think training was definitely a big problem in this field because we are getting some data sets that are larger, but I think the models in this field have not been as hyper optimized to exploit GPU computing. And so I think because of that, training, if you're trying to do any type of large scale training, it can be a challenge, which is why I think thinking about really compute efficient methods is actually pretty critical in this field as well.
I think related to that is like normally you're training for something, like you're training traditionally to find cats and it's on the internet, which that's a question. But if you need to like train your batteries not to explode, or you need to, I don't know, train them to not be very heavy, those are different things. And it wasn't clear to me whether you had to retrain everything at that point, or so I don't know what it is that I didn't understand about the training, but there's definitely something.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just go very quickly. I think the challenge about material science is that a lot of the models a lot of the applications are very niche. They're usually solving for a particular type of material or a specific set of properties. And within that set of properties, you want a specific, range of values. And you could, in the ideal world, you have a universal model that, can be applied to all types of applications. But I don't think that is necessary at this point in time. Or even if it's possible, that would be helpful, because I think a lot of the materials and chemical problems are very specific. So as a result, you probably can make do with more specialized model that are smaller and hence less compute intensive.
Okay, so that's using the model, but given a particular formulation or structure or graph, you're predicting the properties, so that you know what to test.
And the downside of that is that it's not really transferable.
Yeah.
Or less transferable.
I think for us experimentally, we've had to grapple a lot with the training problem, because every time we do a new experiment, we're getting new data. And in theory, one could keep track of all the motion and kinematics data of the robot. You could keep track of all the information from your liquid dispensing robot. You could keep track of your machine health data, in addition to maybe the actual design variables that you care about and your output or your figure of merit. And we often tend to think, or at least within myself and our group, we talk about this really as our design knobs and then our unknown variables. And we often have to compromise that we can't keep track of all of this because of either memory constraints or CPU or GPU limitations, or even getting access to compute. And we're fortunate that we have access to high performance computing, but then the challenge then becomes latency, communications with your high performance computer. You're not training for maybe an hour or 2 hours, but maybe your experiment is 30 minutes. How then do you handle the latency problem? So we've really had to have very honest conversations with ourselves of what data do we even want to keep? What can we keep? How long do we want to keep it? How do we even formulate that actual model? So sometimes we sacrifice on not using a transformer, but maybe using a Gaussian process or even using a support vector machine because these can train on CPUs. And then ensuring that the model choice is then commensurate with the dimensionality of the problem. Anything below 10 dimensions that is maybe a scalar value that we can reasonably discretize, great. We can do it. We can run experiments every night, all week, over the weekend. But if someone says, I have, a smile string and I want every element within that to be my design variable, all of a sudden now we have actual computational limitations we need to think about. So I really think of it as like a waltz. You're trying to figure out what exactly do you want those next moves to be, and what does your experimental campaign look like? And we also tend to not think of our experimental campaigns as static. So as things get better, we can always go back and retrain. So we can have maybe even larger models that we're collecting 5 years ago that might be useful in the future. Maybe we just don't have access to those resources yet. So it is a game of balancing resources, subject matter expertise, prior data, and also computational resources.
So the AI is just a tool in some sense.
Yes.
It's made some stuff possible.
Got a question right back here? Yeah, you.
What I saw across all of your presentations is the multidisciplinary nature of the work that you're doing here. I'm curious, as you think about the next generations of scientists that are going to be coming into these fields, what kind of disciplines would you suggest that people have to develop to become premier scientists like yourselves in these areas?
Well, I guess let's just start with like where you were, I know, hardcore chemist coming out. That's how you started.
Yeah, I'm actually a mechanical engineer. Yeah. So you mean what skills you need to start working as a materials?
Think of it this way. Suppose you were speaking to an undergraduate who said that, I want to go into this field.
Yeah.
And the nature of the field seems to be changing based on what you're describing.
Yes.
AI is going to be the tools. What would you recommend to an undergraduate and say,
So
these are the kind of skills you should develop to become part of the scientific, the future scientific community?
Yeah. I really recommend to start learning Python first. The basic. And then you can build up your knowledge about material science, the basic of material science when you move on from one project to another gradually. And then the machine learning, you can start working in some off-the-shelf, libraries, right? PyTorch or TensorFlow. And then you can start, contributing to open challenges like Agils, or So I think that's what I recommend for anybody who's interested in this.
I feel like I've actually talked to a lot of people about this. So as an outsider, I would say that everybody I talk to, they have a specialty that they've really gotten very deep on. And there's like all these ancillary skills they've had to become a generalist at. There's like the communication pieces of it. There's the Python. A lot of these things they've picked up immediately. And I think it's important to have the passion for the deep thing you want to go through. The other things will come as you need them, just like in any job. So I think from that answer is like, make sure you're tackling a field that actually needs these to be solved this way. Because I'm sure there's lots of fields that just don't even need these techniques in order to move forward.
I could add one quick thing. So over the different students that we take in for different summer internships, we have different types of programs, and they come from a really diverse set of backgrounds, academically and so on. And my question is always to them, what do you want to be an SME or a subject matter expert at? And if someone says, I really want to be the best chemist ever, but that has good knowledge of all the modern tools, then my advice is usually focus on that particular subject matter area, but expose yourself to as many projects or internships or even other courses that you might then be able to gain those skill sets. So whether it's learning Python or learning data structures or learning maybe some robotics, but you don't need to know how to install PyTorch with access to CUDA to be able to then do all your particular chemistry-based work. But knowing of that field is great. And on the flip side, I also get people that are like, I want to be the best applied ML person, but I don't care too much about these subject matter areas. So my advice to them is always, well, let's get you to be the most proficient person in the room to all these ML architectures, all these different languages, whether it's Hugging Face or Databricks or whatever you might need and understanding the ML workflow. And then let's get you to talk to 10 different scientists working in 10 different areas for you to build that expertise of how can we view these different problems through an ML lens. So with those two extremes, I usually then try to find what is that right conversation. For example, we're using a lot of robotics, but we don't typically hire pure roboticists either. So how do we also bridge that gap? So that's usually kind of my approach when thinking through that.
I have two questions. So first, I'd like to understand what are the biggest opportunities in each of your respective areas. I heard more better data sets. I also heard taking better advantage of GPUs. Just to summarize, if you guys don't mind talking about where you feel that biggest critical factor would be for you, each of your areas.
I can start first, and one of the biggest opportunities in our field right now is multimodal learning, combining all of these different characterizations as different representations of materials to learn and improve the predictions that we can make for the properties. We are currently working on these projects at Toyota Research Institute. I think this is one of the biggest, one of the big next things that will happen in the next few years. So.
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of, on the point of combining two areas, I think there's a lot of opportunities to develop new machine learning methods that are actually taking into account the scientific aspect. If most of the PhD students in my group actually double major, usually in physics and computer science, or computer science and chemical engineering, or computer science and math. And I think that niche actually gives you a really strong set of skills to be able to actually understand both sides. And I think actually we're going towards a vision where you don't need to have someone good in machine learning and someone good in chemistry. You can actually start to create a generation of people who actually know both.
Yeah, I think for me, it's trying to find the most important scientific problem of our day, and then making sure that there's all the tools and the tools that we did to solve them. I think both are important. Finding the most important problems and then making sure that whether it's at NVIDIA or not, by making sure that there are tools that help accelerate those, computation.
So I think for me, the kind of the biggest opportunity I see, and I think very selfishly, this comes from a lot of, I think some of my own pain points in my area, is really the open source spirit on the hardware side. Every time you want to build a self-driving lab, it's a lot of money that you need to spend purchasing equipment, but then also a lot of time and energy that is also spent on integrating each instrument to talk to each other, or else you just can't run experiments autonomously. And time again, we've spent a lot of time talking to companies, trying to learn more about a $500,000 instrument. And then only through hours of conversation, you learn that they don't have a Python API for you. And the alternative is to then use Python to write basically a mouse tracking .py. And it's like, wow, I have this $500,000 instrument and I'm running it with a screen recorder. And that has been one of the biggest pain points for us, because how do we scale? What if we wanted 10 instruments like that? So what has then happened, I think, to us is now internally, we're developing a lot of knowledge of what companies we like to work with, what companies offer that type of support. What companies, maybe we love their instruments, but they just don't give us access to their software stack. So it makes it very hard for us to want to work with that. And I think that also bleeds into other areas, because maybe today it's polymers, maybe today it's peptides and lanthanides and batteries or other areas. But what about the problems for tomorrow? And how are we getting ready for that? And the infrastructure that we're building today physically, are we flexible enough to reconfigure to address those other problems that we might not even be anticipating today?
Actually, just a quick plug based off of Aldair's point. I myself am new to this space and haven't played with hardware. There's a really great SF-based community called Hardware Hackers. You can look them up on Luma. And they do these really fun hardware hackathons. I got to be part of one this summer. The problems that Aldair talks about these kind of data islands and really expensive proprietary hardware shows up on the life science end as well. There's a really cool company called Opentrons, which is trying to change that. With sort of, I think they started as a 3D printing company and are now making, liquid handlers and so forth with great Python API that's, you can really dig into. And I got to play with one of those over the summer. So really great opportunity to go hands-on, meet interesting folks, and they have events all the time in the Bay Area. It's Hardware Hackers. The other one is called Bits and Bio, which has some overlap.
So my second question was around ethics, and this is all great when the technology is in the right hands, but how do we make sure as we try to make things open source that it doesn't get into the wrong hands for the wrong purposes?
Could speak to that a bit. So we have a lot of conversations about that and kind of referring to the term of like dual use. And I don't think there is a perfect answer for it yet. I think we're kind of building the plane as we're flying it, because there is this spirit of we want the science to move super fast. Myself, I want the process of scientific discovery to accelerate. Let's all, share data, share code. But I think as time progresses, I think we'll have to start having some types of bounding boxes around that. I'm not saying what those boundaries are, but I think those conversations should be happening. And I think the closest thing to my area, I think we saw that a bit with the rise of additive manufacturing. If you look back at some of those conversations 10 years ago, people were worried that everyone would have a 3D printer at home and be printing all these objects. And I think over time, we kind of saw that technology play out. And I think my guess would be that this should be an active conversation we should be having. And I think ethics should be kind of at the forefront of whatever technology that we're building.
One major question I have around the self-driving lab concept is reproducibility and hidden variables. Because say at your lab, you might have a setup that finally optimizes, say a perfect solution, for example, for some material or engineering problem, mechanical problem with some constraints, like say material use. But often, if you really go far down the optimization route, it optimizes around the quirks of your setup, the quirks of your 3D printer that, might be very different for someone else, somewhere else in the world, trying to solve a similar problem, but starting from scratch and building their own autonomous lab, and they might have very different results. So I'm wondering like how much, say, work has there been in sort of like perturbing these setups or like just showing sort of uniqueness or being able to control variables or even identifying hidden variables we would have never thought about, and then like extending that to, other problems.
So from the experimental standpoint, I feel like that is probably something we don't talk about enough yet, because everyone's trying to say, we built a self-driving lab that's running for 6 months without any human intervention. Let's get that Nature Science publication. But I think from being with these systems and actually just running a campaign last week, we were running a set of experiments, 10 of them, and our data scatter, what should have been the same experiment, was just all over the place, about 2 orders of magnitude different. So what's wrong? So we kind of looked at the Opentrons liquid dispensers, and we saw sometimes the way the plate is placed might be a little bit different, but we don't keep track of that. We run experiments in the day. It might be a little bit warmer than the lab at night at 3 in the morning. And temperature has a critical role in these assays that we're running. So I think now, because of those observations, we're trying to have those conversations of how do we create fair data? How do we even engage in that conversation? But I think the more I think people become okay with bad data, I think the more open people will be to having that conversation. So for us, we don't just disregard that data, we timestamp that data and try to better understand what are those hidden variables or unknown variables that went into that. And in the future, how can we maybe write that into our methodology that if you are running it in some way without temperature control, expect a plus or minus, 10, 15%, but know that 10 plus or minus 10 or 15%, part of it might be from experimental uncertainty, part of it might be from maybe system level uncertainty, and part of it might be from the ML uncertainty. So even I think getting better at how we talk about UQ is also, I think, an important part of that conversation.
I see a few more hands up. I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions, but we'll actually invite you to do it more one-on-one, panelists, insofar as they're able to hang around for a couple minutes. I want to end this actually with just one last question for you all. You've been giving a lot of information to us, which has been awesome. At the same time, we have assembled here a bunch of really talented, smart, ambitious people with access and themselves being great resources. What's one thing that you need help with, that we could help you with in your own projects that would help advance this field forward? I'd love to any of that.
Since you don't know who's out there, you can ask for anything.
That's right.
I can start.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that my team at NVIDIA is looking for is actually bottlenecks that is pertaining to like AI and chemistry and material science. So anything that current computational bottlenecks that you are experiencing right now, like please, reach out to me. More than happy to, share my email after this talk. And that's something that will be helpful, right? Because if we identify a major bottleneck, all the more justification I have with my team to actually go fix it.
Amen. All right. Bottlenecks to Wen Jie. All right. Next. Aditi, what do you got?
If I give a facetious answer, it would be GPUs. So that would definitely, but actually no.
Scale is all you need, right? You said it earlier.
But I think besides that, I think if you have interesting use cases, if you're interested in trying to use some of these methods, or you're interested in trying to see how they interface in some type of cycle, I think that would be really interesting to hear about and talk about more.
Arash.
So we try to make a community around the database, the Polymer database that we generate. But it seems it's very difficult for people to use that. If anybody is interested in using, the database of polymer electrolytes, please contact us, and we will be happy to help you with that. Yeah, I think that will be the best help for us.
Okay, try the Polymer database, give feedback to help make it better. Great.
Different.
Aldair.
So I think for us, and, be careful what you wish for, but would be more, I think, collaborations and outreach. I think with Lawrence Livermore specifically, I think we have right now a really great program that's starting within the Advanced Manufacturing Lab that's located in the Livermore Valley Open Campus. And we're very open to engaging with industry and academic partners. So I think that's very important, not only in engagement and knowing what problems and what technologies exist, but really there's a lot of this conversation around the spin in and spin out model of how can we spin in all of the great technology, the great partnerships that exist out there to better our own internal technologies happening at Lawrence Livermore, and how can we spin that out in a way that's also beneficial to you all. And I think that only happens through constant mutual conversation. So definitely reach out, get in touch. Even if it's not a perfect fit, I think just situational awareness is always great.
Okay, awesome. Conversations and partnerships. I can attest to this. I'm visiting LLNL on Friday with Aldair's invitation, which I'm super excited about. And I know there's actually an open campus, right? That's part of your organization. Great. Well, let's give a big thankful round of applause. So we sat in traffic for an hour and a half, fighting all of the rainstorms and the winds. I'll give one final plug. Here's how you connect with us. Most of you have found out about us through MIT CNC. If you've got questions about the Tab Lab, Here's your man. Here's his address. Or this guy, that's right. Personal plug. I run Yes and Labs, a consultancy. I do these kinds of events. So if you're interested in learning more, reach out to me. I also just started a Substack with cool events around the city. And I think interesting things that are happening in the field. There's the QR code in the URL. But regardless, thank you so much. Get home safe and come hang out with us again. Thanks, everybody.